What is going on, Catella Human Geographers? Mr. Majewski, out of the class today, but still providing that important commercial agriculture knowledge to you via video lecture. We'll try to make this quick, hopefully 40 minutes or less. Let's get started. Mixed crop and livestock farming is your most common agricultural type of farming in the United States and in most of the developed world. It's also Europe as well. We practice these in the middle portions of the U.S. and the middle portions of Europe. So what we would call the Midwestern United States. It uses both crops and livestock together on the same farm. So a farmer is going to be raising livestock, and that might be cows or pigs or whatever, part of the year. And then he's also going to have crops that are growing on that farm as well. Now here's what's unique about it. The crops aren't actually usually grown for human consumption. Most of the time they go to feed the livestock. So you grow the crops on the farm to feed the livestock, then you don't have to pay for feed costs or anything like that because you're supplying it directly yourself. The livestock is fattened on corn, and then it's harvested at the end of the season for its meat or its milk or its eggs or all of those things. And those are actually the major source of money, of revenue for that farm. You can also use the animal manure as fertilizer for crops, not only your own, but potentially for others as well. And so, again, the crops are really there to sustain the livestock most of the time. In the United States, on these farms, these are oftentimes corn farms, all right? So they're going to be growing corn. They might grow a little bit of soybean, but generally those are the two types of crops you will see on a mixed crop and livestock farm. Why did they grow corn? Well, you can produce really high yields of corn on a single piece of land. Think of the cornfields, right? And there's stalks of corn that are right next to each other. There's not a lot of gap in between them or anything like that. You can fit a lot of corn onto one piece of land compared to other crops, which have to be planted in nice, long rows. So ultimately, you can grow a lot more higher yields of corn than you can other crops. On top of that, you can use the corn for margarine, which is kind of like a butter that's produced from corn oil or canola oil, and other human products that use corn as well. A lot of soaps and things along those lines. Also, again, the corn is generally primarily for animal feed, but you do use some of it for human consumption if possible, or if there's extras left over. Now, this area of farming is really popular, as I said, in the Midwestern United States. We call this region of the country the Corn Belt because corn is the most dominant crop that is grown there. Guinness, chill out, please. Thank you. Soybeans are your second most common or popular type of mixed crop and livestock crop that's grown as well. Again, used as animal feed, but also used for some human consumption like tofu and soybean oil. One of the reasons why mixed crop and livestock is so important, well, one, it's the climate. It's the sort of climate that supports corn growing. Two, farmers get income throughout the year. Remember, as a farmer, oftentimes, if you're just growing crops for human consumption, you plant them, in the spring, you got to wait till the end of the fall to harvest them. So you're not really getting any money during that time. But on mixed crop and livestock, the money comes in more evenly throughout the season, right? So that's a very good thing for you because you don't have to go as long a period without any money coming in whatsoever to support the farm. Again, mixed crop livestock, most popular in the United States, and China is the second larger producer. Biggest difference, United States, almost all of it is for export. We produce way more than we need ourselves, whereas with China, a lot of that corn production is subsistence, right? So it's going to meet the needs of the people in China and not exported for profit. The area in the United States where corn dominates is known, not surprisingly, as the Corn Belt, and there it is on the map. It stretches throughout the Midwestern states. If you've ever traveled through Iowa or Nebraska or some of these others, you'll see cornfields as far as the eye can see. And so very much, this is an accurate depiction of where this product is produced. Please remember, corn can be used for corn syrup and other sweeteners, sugars. So it's something that we grow a ton of, even though we don't eat all of the product that is corn. It's turned into other products through food processing centers. Mixed crop and livestock is the style that is located here, right, in the United States. As was just indicated, it would be corn up there. It would be soybean more likely down here. And then throughout the middle central portions of Europe as well is where you see that most commonly. All right, so definitely a commercial agriculture, way more than the meets the needs of the farmer, selling almost all of it for profit. All right, let's get to grain farming. Grain farming is growing of grains, which can be corn or wheat or barley or oats or some sorts of rice and millet. All of those are grains. Grains, by the way, grain farming involves growing the crops for humans, right? So people are actually eating this food as opposed for animal feed like mixed crop and livestock. So your commercial grain farmer sells their crops to the food processors, you know, for snacks, breakfast foods, breads, right? Now in LDCs, most of those grains are consumed on the farm, but in an MDC, like the United States, these grain farmers grow way more than's needed, right? And then they sell the excess supply to food processing companies, maybe some directly to the public as well. The most important grain crop is wheat. It's used for bread and flour. It has higher value than other grains. It's more useful as a human food because it can be turned into so many different food items. It's stored easily. It doesn't spoil very quickly. It can be transported long distances as a result. It doesn't weigh that much compared to the space it takes. It is grown because also it's an international food crop. What we mean by that is we export a lot of grain. Both Canada and the United States do. They're responsible for almost 50% of all of the world's exports of wheat. The U.S. by far is the farthest, is the largest, I should say. Canada, France, Brazil, China, all of them are big producers as well. China's the biggest overall producer, but again, a lot of that wheat stays in the country to feed the population, whereas with the U.S., we're the second largest overall, but we have way more of it that goes off for export. Grain is oftentimes grown in areas that are a little too dry for mixed crop and livestock, especially wheat. Wheat's oftentimes grown in those places where corn wouldn't survive. Work is seasonal on grain farms, right? Because you have to wait for the grain to be harvested, so there's long gaps in work and in pay. So a lot of times businesses will have farms located in multiple locations. There are 2 major wheat belts. They'll have a farm in each, so their workers are working year-round. There are 3 areas of grain farming in North America that you need to be familiar with. 2 of them are very famous. They're called the winter wheat belt and the spring wheat belt. And they're also located in the central portions of the country. You'll notice they're a little bit west of the corn belt. So the corn belt's here, and then it's the wheat belt that's in the drier, more arid states that come further towards the west. The spring wheat belt, as you can see, is located here, kind of in Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado and Nebraska. And then the winter wheat belt is up in like the Montana and the Dakotas areas. It really just comes down to when they plant the crop. Some places you're able to plant it in spring, other places they plant it in the winter, and they've had more success with those practices. There is a little tiny region over here called the Palouse as well that grows winter wheat. That's Washington, famous for their wheat production, also their apples in that area. Wheat farming is totally mechanized now. So you have these huge machines. They're called combines. They look like this, that go across and cut through the wheat fields. Almost think of like a lawnmower would. They reap the grain, which means cut it. They thresh it, which means essentially separate it from the stalk. And then they clean it, which means they essentially, well, as it's explained, remove all the excess particles and pieces so that it's much more easy to be turned into a finished product. So all these machines do all of this at once, and again, one person operating that humongous machine. You can see why there's not a lot of folks working in commercial agriculture. Commercial grain farming is the reddish color. It's there, and it's also here. Over in Europe, you'll see it's almost a mirror of the U.S. going in the opposite direction, west to east. And so you'll see it's just beyond where mixed crop and livestock is. All right, let's keep this train rolling. Dairy farming. So obviously we use livestock for different reasons. Here, this is dairy farming. This is usually closest to the big cities, especially you'll see them in the northeastern United States. You'll see them in southeastern Canada, and you'll see them in northwestern Europe. That's where a lot of the cities are, along the coastlines. And these have to be located a little closer to the cities to get their dairy products to market on time. They are starting to grow in South and East Asia as well. We're starting to see more of these places. As those wealth levels increase, those folks start to kind of imitate or replicate what they see in the developed world. So, Dairy products are highly perishable, so they have to be located closer to the markets than those other drier products like corn and wheat, which will last longer. The area that surrounds a dairy where they can still supply their fresh milk is known as the milk shed. It's usually a ring shape. It's the maximum distance that their product can be delivered and still be fresh. Back in the day, like hundreds of years ago, before modern technology, the milk shed was 30 miles. This was before railroads, this was before refrigeration, and so dairies had to be located within 30 miles of the city in order to supply it. Nowadays, that's usually like 300 miles or even more. This makes virtually every dairy now within range of at least one market. So a milk shed's kind of important, and it's super unique to dairies. Dairy products have almost always been located in MDCs, but there's been some pretty huge changes in recent times. And about half of all production is now in LDCs. The reason why they're almost always in MDCs is that dairy products are almost like a luxury in the developing world. Most people don't get that regularly, and it's definitely not like something that comes prepackaged or whatever and delivered to you in some instances. So dairy is a luxury for folks. It's usually an extravagant thing in developing world, and so almost all of the demand for it has been in MDCs. And so the dairies have located there to meet the need. Again, like most farms, dairies usually sell their products to other businesses. They sell them to milk wholesalers or distributors who gallon the milk, put it into the cartons and then sell it. Or they can also sell it to butter and cheese and other dairy products makers, which have longer shelf life than milk, right? They can last longer. And so the general rule is it depends on how close you are to the market. If you're close to enough to the market, if you're the closest to the market, you usually sell milk. So like dairies that are on the East Coast, they sell milk to the eastern cities. And then dairies that are closer to LA, they're the ones that sell the milk to LA. Now, if you're further away, right, like you're in the Midwest, or you're even in the western states away from California, you're probably going to specialize. You're probably going to sell cheeses, other dairy products, butter, which might last longer than milk otherwise would. So, you think of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a thing where they pride themselves on their cheese, right? That's like one of their selling points. And part of the reason for that is, hey, they were too far away to be able to meet the needs of eastern cities with milk, so they became a specializer in cheese. California does the same, by the way. California cheese. So that it can be shipped all over the world, and especially all over the United States. The biggest challenges for dairies, well, again, very labor intensive, all right? You have to milk those cows twice a day. And even though it is automated and mechanized more than before, it's way more labor intensive than other types of farming are. It's hands-on, you're constantly doing things, bringing cows in, bringing them out, milking them, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, you have to buy feed for your cows because dairies are oftentimes located in places where it's cold winters, especially in Wisconsin and New York and the East Coast. And so these dairies have to bring their cows inside. They're not there. It's not warm enough to allow them to graze during the winter months, so they got to buy food during that time, and that's a cost for a dairy, especially a small one, trying to compete with these corporate ones. Worldwide milk production, not surprisingly, India is at the top of the list, right? Remember, because of the reference for the cow. U.S. milk production is high. India, U.S., China, Pakistan. Again, the U.S. would be the one that's the primary exporter if there is milk to export that can reach nearby locations. So, for instance, like U.S. dairies might be able to supply Canada and even Mexico, depending on their location, but probably not going to be able to get much further than that with their products generally. U.S. dairy locations, right? On this map, it shows you where the cows are. The blue are dairy cows, all right? And you can tell by these have much larger numbers of cows or these have smaller numbers of cows per farm. So these are going to be dairies in the eastern half of the United States. It's going to be cattle ranches for the meat out in the western half of the United States. But you'll see close to the cities is where the dairies have to locate, and most of our cities, remember, are clustered in the eastern half of the U.S. You'll also see dairy locations on the west coast, usually right outside of major cities like L.A., San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, in order to meet the needs of the populations in those places. So again, If you really look at this map, I like it better. The dark red areas on this chloroploth map are where the dairies are located. So you'll see lots there, right? New York, Pennsylvania, to supply the cities like New York City, right? And Boston and Philadelphia on the East Coast. Meanwhile, Wisconsin, right, to supply Chicago and Detroit and other Midwestern cities. And then they can ship their cheese out to the East Coast, right, because they're too far away to serve the milk over there. And then we have Western dairies that supply directly to the big West Coast cities as well. That's where you have your dairies located because of those milk sheds, all right? Dairy farming is this peach color right here, right? Really reflects what we just saw on that last map. And then in Europe, again, it's the extreme northern parts above mixed crop and livestock. So again, moving forward, livestock ranching, used in semi-arid or arid lands with really poor vegetation or soil. You can't grow other foods, right? So you raise livestock instead. It's just too dry. Other types of ags won't work, so you go with livestock ranching. Why? Because the demand for meat in the U.S. has increased massively since the 1860s all the way up till today. Ranches have grown. They depend on cowboys. They did depend on cowboys to drive those herds to railroad tracks that were sent to cities. There were fights out west between farmers and ranchers. But eventually, most ranchers bought large chunks of land in the drier and cheaper areas of the West to avoid that conflict with farmers. There's less income generated with ranching, all right? It's considered extensive because, remember, it's a lot of land, cattle have a lot of room to roam on, right? So you're not necessarily intensively using that land where you're using every square inch to grow as much as possible. Also, you basically just let them chill around, graze, and fatten up. So it's less income generated with it, but there's less operating costs. You don't spend nearly as much on the costs of a farm with a cattle ranch than you do with other types. In fact, most of the cattle land that's used today, it's actually government land that the government leases to cattle people to basically allow them to rent it, to use it on a year-to-year basis. So that cuts down on their costs even more because they don't even have to pay permanently for the land they have. Ranching is threatened by other types of agriculture. Listen, as we bring irrigation and new water techniques to new places, aqueducts and things like that, we can grow crops there, right? And so some places that used to only allow ranching, now they're threatened by new types of agriculture. Also, modern ranchers often raise their cattle on the ranch, but right before they're going to go to slaughter, a few weeks before, they send them to a feedlot to fatten up. These are usually near like major train or railroad locations. If you go up the 5 freeway headed to like San Francisco, you're going to see cattle feedlots on the sides of the 5. And that's by design. They want to be close to the freeways because once they are fattened up, they want to get them to the slaughterhouse as quickly as possible. So, feedlots are places where huge locations for cows, for cattle. But the cattle aren't really allowed to move around or anything like that. And the goal is to kind of get them to stay in one place so that they fatten up a whole bunch right before you slaughter them as well. Alrighty? So anyways, ranchers use feedlots in order to fatten the cows up right before they go to slaughter. There's a lot of controversy about these feedlots because they pollute a lot, and there's concerns that when you bring all those cows together and don't allow them to move around or whatever, it allows for greater contamination of the meat. Anyways, major meat producing areas. I love this map. You need to know this map because you could easily see something like it on the AP exam. Not only do you need to know like who are the biggest meat producers, but you need to kind of know the general products that are produced where. So listen, it's actually not as difficult as it seems, and here's why. Commercial ranching is almost always located in MDCs around the world. Listen, meat is expensive compared to other products, and so generally only MDC consumers can afford it. Remember, especially red meat's not that healthy for you. And so ultimately, it's not something that is oftentimes eaten in the developing world where it's both expensive, right, and kind of a luxury item. And it actually has negative effects on health and things like that in the U.S. and other places as well. Anyways, in the United States, it's cattle that dominates, especially, and ranches are in the western half of the U.S. right? So it's cattle that are located there, and the shaded region really shows you where in the U.S. and Mexico cattle ranching is clustered, all right? Also up into Canada as well. In South America, it's also cattle, all right? So Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, a lot of cattle and sheep in an area in the southern part of South America that's called the Pampas, or the grasslands region. They're also chopping down rainforests so they can build ranches and places and set them up there too. In Australia, the other part of the developed world, you're going to see sheep for the most part, all right, because Australia is drier, and so as a result, sheep, which can thrive in much drier climates, can tolerate that environment. So it's sheep that tends to dominate in Australia. Now in Europe, it's cattle and sheep, mostly cattle, right? And then you'll notice in like Central Asia is an area that has a lot of sheep production, along with some goat production as well. Anyways, the big difference there is only in the United States, really, and even in South America and Australia are you really seeing a lot of export going on, all right? The rest is mostly for subsistence purposes. All right, chicken production in the U.S. Hey, you do need to be aware there's been massive increases in chicken since 1970s. There's just been so much growth in production. And the reason is chicken's considered a healthier alternative to red meats, right? It's concentrated in rural counties in the South. So this map down here shows you where most chicken production is. Again, rural southern counties, also rural California counties in central California, and then of course up in the Northwest as well, in some of those rural areas. They're generally clustered near markets, kind of like dairies are. So you'll see like a lot of them on the eastern portion here, including some up here to provide to New York and other places. And then again, so that they can supply to the West Coast cities as well. Tyson Chicken is the largest chicken manufacturer. Like almost all commercial agriculture, it's dominated by corporations today. So a few corporations dominate the entire process. One thing that's unique about chicken counties, as they're called, which are counties that have had a major increase in chicken production, is a lot of the workers are actually Hispanic. And so Hispanic workers are moving into areas that traditionally haven't had a lot of Hispanics. And so some of these southern counties are now starting to actually have large percentages of Hispanic, Latino citizens, or workers, I should say, individuals living within their communities. Okay? And our ranching is kind of this yellowish color, and you'll see it's all throughout the western portion that we just looked at on the previous map, down in South America, right? And then Australia makes up a lot of our ranching dominant area too. All right, Mediterranean, this is really unique. Mediterranean is super unique climates and super unique physical features at very specific latitudes around the world allow for the perfect kind of specific type of agriculture to form. California is one of those places. It's most commonly in the Mediterranean countries and in latitudes that that are at the same location. And California, if you look at the map here, and we will in a second, falls into that category. So again, Southern California there, look at that, right? And then if you follow that around, you'll notice all of the Mediterranean is at the almost exact same latitude, right? You see how that works. Now you'll notice not all of that latitude gets the benefit, so there's got to be something unique going on here. They're both adjacent to these oceans or seas. I wonder if that has some sort of effect, all right? If you go down to the southern hemisphere at about the exact same spot, folks, what you're going to notice is, wow, there's Mediterranean agriculture right there, all right? Oh, wow, South Africa Mediterranean agriculture as well, all righty? So something's going on there with this Mediterranean. Okay, so it is that 30 to 35 degree latitude, right, north and south, but they border coastlines, and so there's this interesting, cool ocean-to-land breeze that hits them. And it tends to produce hot and dry summers, right, with cool breezes hitting it, and it does unique things to the soil. And so as a result, there are certain crops that are grown here that dominate, that are specifically suited for this environment. And it's considered like the prime agricultural land that's out there. Now we know prime agricultural land is land that's available to grow crops on, right? Well, this is almost like the best of the prime. And horticulture is often practiced, right? And that's the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. So you're growing a lot of different products. Think of like the Mediterranean countries, like Greece and Italy and southern Spain. And that's the sort of products that you're going to know that are going to be grown in Mediterranean agriculture, because that's what thrives. Olives, for instance. California is an olive machine, not only for the product, but also for olive oil. Grapes, especially wine grapes, right, are grown. Figs, dates, artichokes, flowers as well thrive in Mediterranean climates. So roses, citrus thrives in Mediterranean climates as well. So again, hot, dry summers, cool ocean breezes, mid-30 latitudes, they border the coastline and they get those unique breezes that cools the soil in a way that leads to this incredibly productive type of agriculture. All right? It can only be practiced on very limited amounts of land around the world. So the loss of that land is especially harmful. It's like prime agricultural land we can't afford to lose. And yet, because it's in California, surrounded by LA and San Francisco, a lot of that gets swallowed up, whether we want it or not. All right? So all of these products, unique to, southern Europe, right? In southern Europe, they actually grow grains there too, because they got to eat breads and pitas and things like that as well. But in the U.S., no, that land is so valuable. We can grow breads and grains elsewhere, right? Let's use it only for Mediterranean farming. Finally, commercial gardening and fruit farming is our next and almost our last type of agriculture. All right. It's dominant in the U.S. and it's dominant in southeastern United States, so along the coastline of the southeast. So kind of in the areas where we saw chickens being produced, right? It's also known as truck farming, all right? And it does exist in California because these are specifically designed to provide for the big markets on the east and west coast. It needs to be done in humid, warm climates, generally with warm winters and long growing seasons. And the key here is to have access to those huge markets. It says here in the East Coast, but also in the West. Truck farms, as they're called, grow almost exclusively fresh fruits and vegetables for human consumption. They often grow what are called more developed crops that are desired by American and European consumers throughout the year. Even though they don't thrive, right, or they're not a big priority normally, because there's such a demand for them by American consumers, these farms have popped up to meet the need. Lettuce, apples, asparagus, mushrooms, tomatoes, berries are all commonly grown on commercial gardening and fruit farm. The truck farms transport the crops by truck to the market or the food processing center, sometimes by rail as well. Most of the crops, as usual, go to food processing, but some are sold directly at market. And again, it's a highly developed agricultural business. These are like the new types of farms that have popped up that are run by these massive agribusiness corporations. They maximize profit. It's almost complete mechanization. They use as low-cost labor as possible, so oftentimes migrant workers. They experiment really aggressively with high-yield seeds, fertilizers, crops. These are the ones that are like the innovators that are driving mass production. There are some massive truck farms right outside of Bakersfield. There's one that grows the halo, the little oranges or tangerines or whatever they are, and that thing ships everywhere onto the West Coast, and it's basically the one supplier of halos. Also, the little miniature carrots, little mini carrots, right? There are two of the pretty much control all of the mini carrot production, or the baby carrot, I guess they're called, production on the West Coast that are located outside of Bakersfield as well. So these farms produce one product, right? They try to grow as aggressively as possible. They use really modern corporation advertising and packaging. They're maximizing production, oftentimes using migrant workers, and they're sending those fresh fruits and vegetables to market year-round, right? And that's the thing. Normally, these would not be growing year-round, right? And so these farms have to locate in very specific places in order to take advantage of the humid, warm climates, the warm winters, the long growing seasons, to try to grow these products in the U.S. if at all possible. And again, they're specialty products: asparagus, mushrooms, right, berries. people are struggling to survive in a lot of developing countries, let alone have products like that, right, that are especially desirable. Okay. So that's truck farming. Another type of truck farming or commercial gardening and fruit farming are the folks who sell their products at like farmers markets and stuff as well. Although those are usually much smaller versions of this. Truck farming and this sort of stuff is usually dominated by corporations at this point. Process used crop rotation. All right, so one of the things you notice with commercial agriculture is they're always looking for methods to grow more crops. Also, in intensive subsistence, this happens as well, right? So in Asia with rice. Different crops are sometimes planted on a field different seasons or years. Now, fields are sometimes left fallow, which means nothing is grown on them for a period. We already know that, right? That's done in shifting cultivation, but it's also done in commercial agriculture because you don't want to exhaust the soil. You don't want to take away its nutrients so that it's no longer productive to you. So what commercial farmers have done over time is they've come up with a number of methods to try to just increasingly maximize how much they can produce on the same piece of land that they've always had. And over time, they've come up with some really amazing crop rotation methods that in many ways maximize productivity, so have increased the amount grown, the yields, and at times restored nutrients at the same time, which allows that soil to heal and to potentially grow crops for much longer. So there are three major methods, all right, of crop rotation. There's what's called 2-field, 3-field, and 4-field. And the reality is you would start probably with 2-field, right? And then you would switch to 3-field as you needed to feed more people, and then eventually move to 4-field as well. So you'll notice on the board I have each of these diagrammed if you want to take a closer look at them. So 2-field crop rotation is when you divide your fields in half. We'll call it a left and a right side. And in the left side, A, you plant grain, and the B side you leave it fallow. And then year 2, you reverse it and you plant in B and you leave A fallow. The problem here is that at any given time, while this is going to really keep your soil healthy, the problem is at any given time, 50% of your land is not being used. So that's kind of inefficient. You could do that if your populations were very small still, right? But we know as it builds up with more agriculture, there's going to be more strain on that farmer to grow. And so you'll switch to the 3-field method. And 3-field is where now you divide your field into thirds, right? And you grow like a winter grain on one field, a spring grain on the second field. So there'll be different times that they grow and are planted. And then you leave C fallow. And then you exchange that each year. And so now the benefit is you're using more of your fields. You're growing more crops on your fields, right? 67% instead of 50 under 2-field. The problem, of course, here is that you're only leaving 33% of your land fallow, right? So, you're not healing or allowing the nutrients to replenish in as much of the land as you were before. But even as you get pressured more, you could switch over to 4-field. Now, 4-field is really interesting. You divide it into 4s, right? So now 4 squares, each of them 25% of your total amount. And you grow grain on 2 of those 4 squares, right? The 2 opposite from one another. Then you leave one of the squares to rest, and then you leave the other, and in the other one you plant a root crop. Now a root crop like clover, all right, actually replenishes the nutrients into the soil. So while you're growing and potentially able to harvest for a profit, you're also restoring the soil at the same time. So this is like the best setup, right? Leave a little bit of it fallow so that it gets that permanent rest. The other 2 grow your grain crop or whatever you're growing, and then a root crop, which is the key here. Now you don't make as much money off of root crops, but you still make a profit if you can sell them for some purposes, and again, you're kind of replenishing that soil. All right, so that's crop rotation, something that's been perfected in places that grow intensively, like most commercial farming and intensive subsistence. And these are used in order to maximize production to make them higher. All right, folks, that is that. In the time that you have remaining, I would highly recommend that you finish up your third world farmer / first world farmer work. You'll have about, 20 minutes more to finish it up in class today. And then it is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Until then, folks, all right, Mr. M signing off with the agriculture, commercial agriculture. We've still got a lot to cover.